Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Shrikrishna Upadhyaya, and my guest today is Dr. Harshit Kukreja. Welcome to All Things Policy, Harshit, and wish you a very happy new year.
Hey Sri, how are you? Yeah, wishing a happy new year to our listeners too.
So, Harshit, today we are going to be talking about social norms, right? And before we begin exploring social norms in much more detail, this story from Indore comes to my mind. And the story is essentially of how the city of Indore became the cleanest city in the country. And India particularly has been struggling with achieving cleanliness in its public places for the longest time, right? And we have had government campaigns on this. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, of course, try to beautify our city to maintain cleanliness, and this was led by political leaders who signaled to the public that everybody must clean their streets, clean their homes, and keep it clean and hygienic. But at least from my personal experience, it seems that most cities have failed. Like roads are still dirty, garbage is thrown around, garbage collection happens, but of course there are failures, all of it. Except the story of Indore stands out. And why it stands out? Because it is rated as the cleanest city in the country today. And the roads are exceptionally clean, garbage collection works smoothly, people are not littering. So, how did all this happen? And as far as I think of it, the problem in India has always been that people do not care for their public spaces. I mean, there is nothing which stops them from littering it, although they might care so much about their homes, keeping their homes clean, but they don't give the same treatment to the public spaces they occupy. So, how do you think Indore managed to change the norms around this?
So Indore is a very interesting example. So there's a Swachh Survekshan ranking. Basically, it ranks cities according to their cleanliness and sanitation. So Indore, somewhere in 2015, it was 180. So it ranked 180 in cities, and in 2017-18, it rose to rank one, and currently it stands on rank one. What they did was, so there's one level of what is the existing social norm, what is the existing socio-cultural understanding of what should be done and what exists, and there's another level which is usually much higher about what the law or the regulation or the rules say.
Yeah.
So there's a huge gap between this. So what Indore did was they did put disproportionate state resources to close this gap, and they achieved it. Nobody knows exactly what was the magic formula, but they did a very successful behavior change campaign. They put large fines. They basically put disincentives and incentives around cleanliness and around sanitation. They had municipal corporation cars, the vehicles going around at night checking and finding people for cleanliness. Obviously, there's a huge opportunity cost attached to this, but they did it very successfully. And we don't know the magic pill or the magic potion they used, but what they did was they closed the gap and they pushed what people thought should be done to what the rules and regulations say. So
Yeah.
they matched it and they got a very successful. Now they are ranked one, I think, from the last 4 5 years. So they are the cleanest city in the country.
Yeah, and that's phenomenal success, right, in such a short period of time. And especially given such a massive public policy problem, such as keeping our streets and keeping our city clean. And to have achieved it in such a short framework really stands, in short time frame really stands out for me. The question then really becomes about how do we ensure that we bridge this gap when it comes to other social norms at play, other laws at play, and there are multiple of them. And in India it's always been the case, right? Okay, law says something on the paper, the regulation says something on the paper, but the actual behavior of people is nowhere close to the ideal which is prescribed. So this is a massive public policy problem according to me, and I believe you have some insights from biology which will help us understand what these social norms are and how we can actually sort of tweak them, how we can ensure change is happening in the society by tweaking these social norms. So let's go through it step by step, right? So first of all, I want to understand from you, what are these social norms?
So basically, in very plain language, social norms are informal rules that govern collective behavior in society, in human societies and groups. So these are rules which people think should be followed and they follow it. And a more academic definition would be that these are rules of behavior that individuals prefer to conform. They're like basically two conditions. So before I introduce social norm, there's a thing called reference network. So for instance, my reference network at office is you, my other colleagues, so other people who work here. My reference network at my home is different. So every person has a reference network who he looks up to and who sees and picks up cues for behavior, and he has feedback loops with them. So basically, every person has like n number of people who he sees as his network. So social norms are said to be like these are rules of behavior which confer to two conditions. First is most of the people in the reference network, for instance, I am sitting at office, should conform to those social norms. This is empirical expectations. For instance, coming to office is a social norm that most people in office conform to. Coming to office on whatever days we have, whatever meetings we have, is a norm that we conform to. So it's an empirical expectations of people.
Yeah.
So this is my reference network. Everybody is coming, so I should also come because everybody is doing it. Second is normative expectations, that I believe that I should go to office because it is my job. I do work at that office. So social norms are rules which follow both of these conditions: the empirical expectations that others in my reference network would be doing it, and the normative expectations that most people in my reference network believe, and I believe that I should conform to it. So these are basically collective behaviors
Yeah.
in which this is a good definition I liked, and I like to use that: the empirical expectation and the normative expectation.
So thanks for that explanation, Harshit. So from what I gather, collective behavior is of two types, right? So one is independent, which is very individual in its sense, and the second is interdependent, where individual behavior is essentially shaped by the the reference network around him or her, right? And in a lot of situations, a social norm may not emerge from what I see because there is a normative expectation. For example, I think everybody would believe that the streets in their city or in their village or outside their home should be clean, but the empirical expectation would be such that everybody is littering, right? So I think a social norm is not emerging from this situation precisely because one of the conditions, which is empirical, is not being satisfied, while I believe the normative expectation exists, right? So if under this framework, like going a step ahead, I want to know from you the life cycle of a norm, in the sense how, like, put it very simply, how does a social norm emerge and what it takes to create such a norm in the first place.
Okay, first a comment. You like categorized collective behavior into two. So the first one, you talk about independent. It is not outcome independent. So it is only independent. I don't. For instance, I think it's rainy. I should carry an umbrella. So that is independent of if you carry an umbrella or not. I don't care if you are my neighbor and you don't carry an umbrella. I don't want to get wet. I'll carry an umbrella. So it is not outcome independent. It is behavior independent. And the second type, interdependent, is like, yeah, it depends. Fashions, social norms basically are come under this category. So the life cycle, there's a lot of literature, but this is a summary around it. So first, a social norm is created or it already exists. So for instance, you say jaywalking. So jaywalking basically means crossing the road other using not using the zebra crossing. So that social norm doesn't basically exist in our society. It exists in a lot of Western society where it's a norm that you cross the road on the zebra crossing and don't do it.
At other
Yeah.
places, yeah.
So first, a norm is created. For instance, maybe the government creates a rule, or there's a norm pre-existing, but we don't know. As an observer, we don't know. Maybe it exists or maybe it does not. Then there's transmission. So transmission is that you have to cross the road while using the zebra crossing. So then there's identification, internalization, that I see that, oh, everybody is crossing from a zebra crossing. Crossing the road from zebra crossing is a good way to go about it, and I should do it. And after this is done, after internalization, the norm usually settles down, and it if the forces which shape the norm, and if societal forces, socio-cultural factors that change, so the norm may be forgotten. Maybe, for instance, we talk about child marriage. So child marriage, because the factors around child marriage changed because of certain societal pressures, governmental intervention, XYZ factors. So the norm was now forgotten.
Hmm.
Even if at the time it was very set in our socio-cultural practices. It was very set that you have to get your child married maybe after 9, before 13, or whatever range is in your area, whatever range goes in your area. Now it is forgotten.
Right.
So it may get forgotten after the society thinks,
Yeah.
not the society is not a being, it cannot like think. If the
Right.
society, various factors decide that, so this is not relevant, or this is not
A valid norm
yeah,
anymore. Yeah.
and it basically you forget the norm. The society does not follow the norm anymore.
Yeah. So let's look at this framework in a little bit more detail, right? What you spoke of. So there are 5 steps essentially, just to recap. First is creation, followed by transmission, identification, internalization, and the final one is forgetting. And this is basically the life cycle of any social norm. And when we think of creation now, there are multiple entry points, right? Now, the government is always trying to create new norms. They bring in new rules every time. For example, they brought a rule that you should wear helmet, and then they brought another rule saying even the pillion riders should wear helmet. And then they started increasing the fine so that more and more people conform to this rule and all. So I think these norms are being started by the state in this case. And in the other case, it can be more cultural, social, and religious as well. So there are multiple entry points for creation. And transmission, I think, really depends on your context, because one, of course, the government can only use formal means of communicating, but culture is not like that. It works in a very dispersed manner, and more people may start emulating something because they see it in their immediate surroundings, right? And finally, it gets identified as a norm. Like, people do understand and identify that, throwing garbage on the streets, I mean, going back to my favorite example in today's podcast, that throwing garbage is a bad thing, right? Now that identification exists. And I think the real problem is with internalization, right? So why are we stuck at this step? Why do so many, and this works in both ways, in the sense, firstly, there are certain desirable social norms which are not getting internalized, and second is there are certain undesirable social norms which have probably been internalized, but now you're not forgetting them, like you said, of child marriage, although that instances might have come down in the recent years. But let's look at something called something like smoking, right? And smoking is a good example because
Yeah.
a lot of people pick it up through their reference networks.
Like extending your example, ODF, open defecation.
Right.
So even after a lot of governmental efforts and a lot of governmental resources, state resources, a lot of states are not open defecation free. So this is an undesirable social norm
Yeah.
which the society thinks should be eliminated, but we are still not able to eliminate it fully. And
Yeah.
even though you have created a lot of incentives, you have created a lot of fines, you have given toilets to people, you have made toilets, maybe it's successful, it is not. Even in places which have like 100% toilets in their houses, a lot of people don't prefer going in their toilets. So
Correct. Because the age old social norm still continues to hold good, and despite the government
yeah,
intervention, change has not happened. Which is why I think, like, yeah, these 2 steps, internalization and forgetting, I think are the most pertinent here, at least according to me. And the question really is, how do you internalize the desirable social norms? I mean, from a public policy angle. And secondly, how do you sort of like forget the undesirable social norms? So, what are your thoughts?
a lot of people believe that first the polluting part, that defecating in your house is polluting to the house, whatever. You should not defecate in the same place as where your kitchen or your temple is, in that same area. And a lot of people believe that defecating in open has certain advantages. So you have to first of all acknowledge these exist, these factors exist. You cannot just say though, so we have made a rule open defecating is bad, and just say that open defecating is bad, and it will not change this behavior. Even if you put toilets inside the houses, even if the government is putting toilets inside the houses, this
Yeah.
behavior has not been changed in a lot of places. So you need to look at these things and say that, yeah, so this is the reason for these upholding of this social norm, and these are the factors that we have to somehow put out of people's mind. For instance, you can say that, yeah, so the toilets will make, instead of this was, I think, some study somewhere, they put an extra layer of bricks in between the toilet and the rest of the house,
Right.
and they put some plastic sheet or something, and they said, oh, so this is separate
Okay,
from
yeah.
the main
So
house.
there was a notional separation which sort of addresses the pollution problem in the
Yeah,
minds of the people.
and you say that, oh, the pipelines are different, the door opens outside. You have to do things like that, and you have to acknowledge. You cannot just say, so this is a dumb
Yeah.
reasoning.
Yeah.
You have to acknowledge that these exist, and this is
Yeah.
how you'll be able to slowly.
No, that's a good example, because that actually brings me to my next point, which I'll come back to after the short break now. Welcome back to All Things Policy. I'm in conversation with Harshit on social norms today. So, Harshit, the example that you mentioned is very pertinent because I think it's an illustration of how public policy inculcated the social norms and the social experience of people to design an effective solution as opposed to imposing an external standard upon the people's life. So, you could achieve the objectives of open defecation while at the same time sort of respecting people's sensibilities around pollution that is caused by toilets. So, Harshit, before we proceed, I wanted to sort of go back to the initial discussion we had between regarding collective behaviors and how there is actually a difference between social norms and collective behavior in the sense that all social norms do not classify as social behavior. So, is there sort of a way to understand this in more detail? How do you sort of go about differentiating between the two?
So there's a very nice categorization that I tend to refer to again and again. So you look at collective behaviors and you see that people prefer to follow it irrespective of what others do. So this can be a custom, a steered moral rule, or something, a legal injunction. Okay. The second category is people prefer to follow if they have social expectations. Social expectation is the normative and the empirical expectations we talked about. So in that second categorization, there are like two subcategorization. One is empirical expectations that if other people will in the reference network will conform to it. That is a descriptive norm. So this is empirical expectations, yes. Normative expectations are not
No.
needed in this. A social norm is where there's empirical expectation and normative expectation also. So normative expectation is that most people believe that you have to also follow it. So people are following it, and most people also believe that you have to follow it. For instance, the cleanliness example in Indore. So most people are doing it, and you also believe that you have to follow it. So it is a social norm per se. So the categorization broadly is that you divide it into two, and which you talk about if there are social expectations or not. If there are social expectations, you talk about empirical expectations and normative expectations. If there are only empirical expectations, it is a descriptive norm. If there are social expectations as well as if there are normative expectations and empirical expectations, that is a social norm. For instance, the indoor thing, or maybe queuing up at airports and things like that.
So, what could be a descriptive norm which is not a social norm?
So, for instance, look at fashion trends. So, you look at what other people are doing. For instance, you see that, oh, so blue shoes are in fashion or white shoes are in fashion. And you see that, oh, everybody is doing it. It's a, what do you call it, fashion fad.
Right.
And then you do it. You don't believe that you should do it.
Hmm.
You're doing it because others are doing it.
Right.
So, it is a descriptive norm. You see that others are doing it and you think, yeah, we should
Correct.
also do it.
So, coming to public policy, right? So, essentially, what we are concerned with mostly are social norms and not just descriptive norms, right? So, social norms should essentially meet both the conditions that you set out earlier, which is of having empirical expectations that everybody else is following it, and the normative expectation that you ought to be doing this. Like, this is probably the right thing to do. So, going ahead and let's take a look back at the Indore example, where one of the ways in which they successfully tweaked or in fact influenced and changed social norms was by this method of increasing state resources which are being applied to solve a particular problem. So they sort of had massive expenditure in keeping their city clean, and it has paid off dividends. But is that a sustainable model? Because every problem cannot be solved in such a manner. And the second question is, if this is not the best way to do things, then how do we influence social norms from a public policy angle so that the gap that we talked about earlier is reduced?
So some eminent people in the field they argue that after you put a lot of effort in changing a social norm, there comes a threshold. If you cross that threshold, the effort required to maintain that social norm or prevent it from being forgotten is quite less. So, for instance, you Indore put a lot of effort in making their city clean and internalizing that social norm that cleanliness and sanitation is paramount and everybody should do it, you should follow it even if nobody is there is no state looking over your shoulder. So you now also have normative and empirical expectations. After some time they'll cross that expectation, they'll cross that threshold, and after crossing that threshold maybe the effort required, the state capacity, the state resources required to maintain this social law would be quite less. Maybe a 2, 3, 5% random number. This is what I think it would be of whatever effort they are putting. So I would argue that this is not a sustainable model, because at the time the resources they have put, maybe in like 5, 7 years they have put in making the cleanest city in the country, those resources could have been spent on law and order, could have been spent on healthcare. So instead of having municipal vehicles roaming around and finding people at night, I think that money and resources would have better been put on like police vehicles preventing crime. But this is also an argument that once you force and you cross that threshold, so it is all justified, because then you can concentrate on any other problem you have, social norms you want to change. But Indore, this was a outlier. So even after a lot of sort of social norms that people want to change, they have not been able to change it so quickly. And maybe I don't know how it will play out in the long run. Maybe they'll not never meet that threshold. Maybe they'll have to maintain that pressure always, because people change, people's behavior change, and you default to whatever is the easiest.
Correct.
So maybe,
and as we know, social norms can be forgotten.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have made it in like such few maybe months, or maybe at most 2, 3 years. So maybe they'll have to like put a lot of state resources to sustain it for a longer period of time, and maybe that is not justified to other problems and not a optimum use of state resources. But there's literature which says that once that threshold is possible, and that threshold usually is very near, once you reach that, once you cross that, state resources or whatever cultural forces you are putting it, there's no need to use disproportionate.
So I think you need to push it till a point where it becomes sort of self-perpetuating.
Yeah, but we don't know where that point is.
And if you're going to miss that point, then you'll have to expend far more resources. The sunken cost keeps going up, and you end up changing nothing. So that's the
opportunity cost is
very high.
High.
And also continuing, from what I think, it appears to me that this sort of like a solution can be adopted at a very localized level, at a contained sort of atmosphere where high intensity resource application will bear fruits, and that the threshold is not very far. I don't know if this can actually be applied to the problem of solving the fact that Indians do not like standing in queue, but maybe at a localized level of, say, an airport, you can still sort of expend high resources, have like 20 different guards standing at every juncture and telling you to go join this line, that line, or having a very organized space where you do your check-in, then you go to your security, and then you go to your boarding. And there is a lot of manpower involved at all stages. None of this is cheap. None of this comes cheap, but it has been a great success compared to the rest of the country, where people do not like to stand in queues at all. So do you think that's one of the applications of this kind of like a solution?
Yeah, so if you look at airports, they have that state capacity, those resources to make you, force you into standing in queues, and they spend a lot of resources on doing that and making sure you stay in queues. So an anecdotal example that I like to give is, so I've stayed in Delhi for a long time. I've been born part of Delhi. So if you look at one of the major interchange stations, Rajiv Chowk, earlier there used to be a guard or a whatever they employ at every gate of the metro, who is to tell people to stand in lines. So first you have to allow people from inside to come out, and then you go in. This is a smooth process. And even if you don't go in that train, at least the person who needs to get off at that station is able to. The Rajiv Chowk is a very highly used area. It has a lot of footfall, a lot of passengers. So what I've observed is eventually, at least in off-peak timings or even in peak timings, there's a guard for every 2 or 3 sort of doors. There's no guard at every door. So people, they don't queue as nicely they used to do earlier. But if there's a guard like every 2, 3 gates, or every bogie, or like every train, or 2 guards every train, even then people now are queuing, and they let others come out first, then they go after. So this change has been noticed. So maybe spending high state capacity at one time. And this problem, if you look at, for instance, if we talk about cleanliness, I don't think in those major problem, the first problem they could have tackled with this was cleanliness. This was not an optimum use of resources. But I think in a localized case like Delhi Metro at Rajiv Chowk, solving for queuing has led to a lot of less ruffles, led to a lot of optimization of your time. You don't need to fight. You don't need to there are a lot less fights. People are now able to peacefully enter the train and
Yeah.
get off from the train. So at localized places like this, in which that problem is high priority. So this is the same approach that they take in infectious diseases. For instance, with polio, a lot of multilateral organizations and a lot of countries, for instance, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wanted to eradicate polio, and they put in. So this is not social norms. This is like putting huge state resources to eradicate one problem, and they put in like a lot of state resources to eradicate polio. So this is a disease specific, problem specific approach you can take to solving public policy problems.
And it need not be specific to the case of social norms as well. So I think many
Yeah.
problems can be solved this way. But then, of course, the problem is of allocation of public resources, opportunity costs of
trade-offs,
making it, and all of it. Yeah. Sure. Thank you so much, Harshit, for joining me on this podcast today. I'm sure the listeners enjoyed this insightful conversation on social norms. And if you have any policy suggestions on changing social norms in the country, please do write to us, tweet to us, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Shri, for having me. Very interesting conversation.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcasts app, IVMPodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.